sun is not shining. This is bizarre weather for us, so I'm so sorry for folks from out of town who have to handle this. And what a day it is. We woke up to all sorts of news from both coasts. As a proud Californian, I would be remiss to start off this panel on democracy without honoring our now late Senator Dianne Feinstein, who served as a trailblazer in the Senate. Even if we didn't agree with all of the things that she did, which at times I did not, we can all most certainly honor and respect the incredible work that she did as a leader of the Senate. We have an incredible panel for you today. This is Empowering Democracy, the intersection of race, rights, and ranked choice voting. A conversation I cannot wait to have and to hear so many of these incredible insights from these wonderful folks who are doing this work from around the country. My name is Sarah Sadwani. I'm a political science professor and have the great opportunity of serving on the California Citizens Commission here in the Golden State. Thank you. But we have an incredible conversation because ranked choice voting is something that's taking storm across the country. Although I will share that here in Los Angeles, where we are on the precipice of reform, it's not really something that's on the table. And largely because there's a lot of concerns from many reformers about what the implications would be for communities of color and for voting rights. And so I cannot wait to have this conversation and really learn more from all of these incredible experts that we have here today. So I'm going to jump right in because I know we don't have a whole lot of time. And I'm going to right with Cliff Albright, co-founders of Black Voters Matter. And Cliff, credit, and I encourage you all, please take a look in amongst materials. This is an incredible panel, so please take a look at everyone's bios. But Cliff, tell us first, is there a relationship between the fight for voting rights and election reforms like ranked choice voting and fair districting and proportional representation? And if so, how would you describe that relationship? What does that look like on ground?
It's a great question. Before I start, I just need y'all to help me with something real quick. Partially, Mike was saying, you know, it's 9 o'clock on the last day. So y'all help me out. When I say black voters, you say matter. Black voters. Black voters. Right, y'all just did this. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, brother. Oh, and so, you know, I did that for a couple of reasons, not just because it's the name of our organization, but because those 3 words represent and symbolize a principle that hopefully everybody in this room agrees with, right? And by the sound of it, by the volume y'all had, I think we all do agree on that. Yes, there's a connection between this world of voting rights and civil rights and the world of good governance. The challenge, and we know this for a couple of reasons, right? We know this because some of the traditional things that we think of when we think about voting rights, we know are under attack. We know that we were, up until a few weeks ago, we were literally this close to there being nothing left of the Voting Rights Act, as many of us thought that the Milligan decision was going to go in one direction, further weakening of Voting Rights Act, which had already been gutted in 2013, but then possibly attacking and getting rid of Section 2. It did not happen though, but we're still this close. And so what we know is that many of the tools that we think about when we think about civil rights and voting rights, they are important, but they're not necessarily enough. We've got to have some other reforms. We've got to have some structural reforms, right? But those structural reforms, whether it's ranked choice voting or proportional representation, which I support, any of the other structural good governance, good democracy, whatever you want to call it, that's not a replacement for civil rights. That's not a with the outright voter suppression that we see on a regular basis in Black communities all across this country. And part of the challenge is that those 2 worlds that we started off asking about that do intersect, unfortunately, in the way that the word carries out, they don't. You know, and there are some good reasons for that, right? There are folks within the civil rights, voting rights community which, quite honestly, are a little distrustful of some of the good democracy, good governance discussions, because sometimes those discussions, if we're going to be honest, are carried out in a way that is just as race neutral and colorblind as the Supreme Court when they just got rid of affirmative action. And so we can't engage in that. We can't not have a discussion that intentionally deals with race just in the name of structural reform. And we've got to be honest about that. In fact, sometimes not only is it just colorblind, some of the discussions, sometimes they are actually antagonistic to the interests of Black communities, can actually decrease power in Black communities if not addressed from a perspective that takes race and race equity into account. And so we got to be honest about that. And the same thing applies to the ranked choice voting discussion. I'm gonna be honest, I like ranked choice voting. I think that it's got a lot of potential for decreasing polarization and for opening up choices. There are a lot of good aspects, but my interest in ranked choice voting came about mainly because of my interest in Sister Lonnie, Professor Lonnie Grenier's work on proportional representation. Right? Please give it up for Lonnie Grenier, and she rests in power. That was my entry point, hearing this woman. And if she had had a chance to have a national dialogue that could have taken place in 1992, 1993, when she was nominated for the Department of Justice, if she could have had a hearing where we could have had a full national discussion on proportional representation, we might be in a better place 30 years later today on both proportional representation and ranked choice voting and a whole bunch of other things. But that wasn't allowed to happen. So that was my entry point to proportional representation and to ranked choice voting as a path or as a part of getting to proportional representation. But as I've learned more about RCV over the years and the way it's been implemented, the ways that it was implemented in Cincinnati, and as Sarah said, we've got some material that we put into the Hoover app that includes some background on ranked choice voting and some of the history. And some of that history includes in Cincinnati, where ranked choice voting was used to actually increase Black representation in the city of Cincinnati, right? And it was so successful for 2-3 decades that eventually the white community, the white power structure there said, you know what, we might need to get rid of this structural reform in order to decrease Black representation. And that's exactly what happened, right? And so I started to learn more about the ways that ranked choice voting has been used and the ways that it actually has increased Black power and Black representation. Started to learn about places like Memphis, right, a southern city where people voted for ranked choice voting only to see the Tennessee state legislature, right? The same Tennessee state legislature that voted to expel 2 of the members, right? Recently, the same Tennessee state legislature that's been engaged in all kinds of shenanigans. That same Tennessee state legislature voted to preempt Memphis and the ability of other cities to use ranked choice voting as a mechanism. And so in my mind, anytime Republicans in Tennessee try to keep something away from us, that's something I want to look at, right? That's something I want to find out some more about, you know. And so, and it's not just that. You know, Sarasota, same thing in Florida, preempted their ability to use ranked choice voting. And so, when we look at the ways that's been used, even when we look at the New York election, I know many of you already know this, historic New York City election, most diverse council ever, first time ever, majority women. So when we look at the way, right? That's right? And so when we look at the ways it's been used, yes, there's a lot of potential in this discussion. And so when people say, well, hey, Cliff, where do you stand? Where does Black voters matter stand on ranked choice voting? Are you all in? One of the things I always say is I am all into the fact that we have got to have this discussion. We can no longer not have this discussion in our communities. We've got to broaden, and that's what's been happening over the past couple of decades. It's been widening, it's been gaining acceptance, it's being used more and more places, but it has not really penetrated the South, right? And it has not really penetrated most of the communities where Black folks live. We are committed to playing a part to expanding that discussion, to pulling young people into discussion. We've got a program that we're working on with our friends at Fairvote to expose college students, particularly at HBCUs, to ranked choice voting. And so we're committed to expanding that conversation and pursuing this structural reform, but we are equally committed, in fact, maybe more committed to that. As we do so, we, in whatever space we go to, including this room, are going to be deliberate about insisting that race has got to be an intentional part of that discussion. Any discussion of ranked choice voting that does not deal with the potential impact on the power of Black communities is not a discussion that we want to be in. Thank you.
This is wonderful. This is great. So it begs some questions then. So the voting, should the Voting Rights Act community then, and I'm going to turn it next to Nisha, should the voting rights community of activists, should they be supporting these kinds of structural reforms? And if so, what are some of the key concerns that communities of color are facing, particularly in liberal states like Massachusetts, where you come from, and in some of the work that you've done to advance opportunities for ranked choice voting?
So a couple of things. I want to take a step back. I think for those of us who believe in the great promise of this country, the great promise that a multiracial democracy presents for all of us in the pursuit for freedom, justice, and equality, I believe that in order for us to truly have the type of democracy we deserve, we have to acknowledge that we are evolving as a democracy. And so too must the structures that support that democracy. The idea that we would maintain a democracy, a system of democracy that started hundreds of years ago, that did not include, as I look around this room, any consideration for the majority of us in this room. The idea that we would continue to support and advance that structure does a tremendous disservice to our democracy and the one we are trying to achieve. And so, yes, it is critically important that, as Cliff shared, as we're thinking about the evolution of our democracy and the structures that support that democracy to help us achieve a truly multiracial, inclusive democracy, that we are intentional about all people. That includes people of color, generally speaking, that includes Black folks specifically, that includes women specifically, that includes all of us. And so I answer the question that way because, not to give short shrift to the importance of intentionality relative to race and ethnicity in the conversation, but it is to say that there is no conversation about a strong democracy that does not have integrated into that conversation and debate Black folks, Hispanic folks, Black folks, and women. You can't have the conversation. We cannot achieve the objective without being inclusive. So I don't want it to be an appendage to the movement. You follow what I mean? It is part of what we are all striving to achieve. And so when I born and raised in Massachusetts, I am proud of the Commonwealth and so many ways in which we have been on the front lines of advancing our democracy. But at the same time, I realize that in the Commonwealth, we still have a lot of work to do. And we are not always we are not always the beacon we aspire to be. And it's one of the reasons why it has been important to me in the work that I do in the civil rights community and the voting rights community to ensure that we are building coalitions with non-traditional allies, to ensure that we are actively and openly looking at structural reforms that are coming from, again, non-traditional allies. Ranked choice voting is not widely accepted within the Black community. And one of the reasons just like several other structural reforms, but ranked choice voting in particular, and at the root of that, my friends, is trust. When we talk about, in the Black community, when we talk about the power of voting, there's no community in this country that understands the power of voting like the Black community. We believe that if we achieved the right to vote, that we would vote, and that we would be able to then have self-determination over our lives and over our communities. But generation after generation, what we've seen is that the system is not trusted by the people. And if the people don't trust the system, the people are not going to participate in the system. And so this idea, this movement that we have that I believe is critically important around, again, the evolution of democracy and the evolution of the structures, this movement that we have that is calling us to do different requires at its root a base level of trust. And we've got a whole community that's struggling with trust in the system. You told us to do it this way, and we play by the rules. And what we're seeing time and time again is that you like to change the rules. When we start playing and we start winning, more representation of people of color, more representation of Black folks, more representation of women, more representation of the LGBTQ community, y'all want to change it up. And so we've got to deal with trust. Because what's happening is a healthy level of skepticism, but a level of skepticism that is not allowing us at the same time to move at the pace at which we need to move in order for this, again, this democracy to work for all of us. And so I want to encourage, I want to thank those of us in the room who are already in the movement. I had the opportunity to co-chair our statewide ballot initiative in 2020 that just missed the mark a little bit. And I'm currently the co-chair for Ranked Choice Boston. And I know we're going to get that done, Nathan. We're going to get that done. We're going to get that done. So I want to thank you for being in the movement, but I also want to really challenge all of us to ensure that as we continue to build this movement, to expand this movement, that it is truly an integrated movement in the way in which we're building. We're not thinking about racial justice as an add-on. We're not thinking about gender justice as an add-on. It is the movement, okay? So I want to challenge you in that. I want to also challenge us that in order to do that, our rooms, our spaces where the strategy is set need to be more diverse. Okay? They need to be more diverse. Because as one of my good friends, a city councilor in Boston says, nothing for us without us is about us. Okay, so really challenging a more integrated, inclusive movement, because in that I firmly believe we will be able to achieve more and achieve more at a faster pace. And that's what our democracy needs right now.
That is so right on, right? And here in Los Angeles, California, I say as we have these conversations about changing the ballots, changing electoral systems, we've had a lot of great changes in California. We have a very inclusive voting process. Folks can vote for about a month in advance. Ballots are sent to people's homes in multiple languages, and still in 2022, Latino turnout was only around 20% in the city of Los Angeles. So despite all of these efforts to make things more accessible, we continue to see low voter engagement. And then when we think about adding on additional changes, something like ranked choice voting or completely changing our electoral system, it's like, how's that going to work when we're trying to translate it into 12 different languages already? Will people understand, or will it turn off to folks? And so I take those comments very much to heart. And I want to turn now to the wonderful council member from New York City, Amanda Farias, who ran under ranked choice voting. And I want to hear a little bit about your experience as a candidate having to run under an RCV system. What were some of those benefits? What were some of those drawbacks? And what did that look like for the voters that you were really trying to do outreach to? How did that work for them?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Have a warm reception. I've had to write notes down because I think there's a lot of benefits and challenges that we saw, so please give me some grace referring to this. But running as an RCV candidate was one, I think, very exciting because it was a new electoral system that we were implementing. It was a way to see in our communities, at least how many of us see it as a way to be more collaborative, a way to get your message out there a bit more. But I think, and I appreciate Tanisha and Cliff's comments around the trust, and what I always talk about is the apathy that people have with government and with electoral systems that really were not created and built for any of us to participate in actively and get real representation. And so there were definite challenges that we saw. In New York City's electoral cycle, we have a public matching. So I think one of the first things was money to run these elections and to use that for the education and outreach. I was in a cycle that it was being newly implemented post-COVID or in the midst of COVID, where we saw very little and limited outreach. People were still kind of nervous to come back outside and to stand in long lines. We really were not sure how we were going to anticipate voter turnout. And we historically already have low voter turnout in our elections. So definitely from a candidate perspective, looking at RCV as a way that we're supposed to raise money to elect ourselves, but also collaborate with other members on the ballot, and to really figure out how do we make sure that we're not only partnering with people that have the equal amount of money that represent our values and are similar to me, right? Requires money to help those candidates get their name out there, right? And then I think that's one of the important parts, finding the candidates to collaborate with and ensure that we weren't, or I wasn't, going against my own messaging or my own values, and could see the person, if I lost, and be proud of them winning that election, right? And what I found is, with some of those challenges was not everybody had the same fundraising ability as I had, which meant that their message was only going to their small base. And I had to find ways to use my fundraising ability to do, mailers or lit pieces with both of us on it to help get their message out, which I think for candidates feels a little bit counterproductive. It's like you're kind of messaging against yourself in a way. But I think with that as well, it helps align like who you're working with and collaborating with. It helps shows beyond talking points and taglines to voters that there's trust amongst candidates that have similar values, and that helps bases grow. And I think come over to the other side. And the great benefits that I saw, I think immediately was just more engagement. People were more curious. They were very curious about candidates working with one another. I mean, I was very proactive in my race. I allocated about $45,000 to the candidates that I collaborated with. And again, we have a public fund process in the city, so some of that money is worth it when you're collaborating, because I wanted to make sure that people saw we were doing events together, we were doing food distributions together. A lot of our labor unions and our PACs know how to then reevaluate their endorsement process to say, 2 people, 3 people, 5 people, how do we still, with the lack of investments from the local government in outreach and education, help people understand that this isn't just a 1 to 5 checklist. This is like, you need to do the research, you need to understand why you're picking people. If your number 1 doesn't see a victory, are you okay with the number 2? Are you proud of that number 2? It's a lot more effort. And so that process in and of itself for the first time was a bit difficult for all of our acts and labor members. And then I think what I saw as someone that would be deemed, and I think this was a larger challenge that candidates now, or maybe in these upcoming cycles, will see more of. Even though my seat was an open seat, I had run for it prior without ranked choice voting and had come in as the runner-up. And so I was the perceived, front runner. He actually kind of encouraged a block of candidates against me to strategize like that I was, the person with the most money and the most support, and like the person that is, no one's never used the word sellout, but basically like, selling out and like the next to be. And that wasn't something I anticipated as someone that challenged the boys club and ran against the power structures, the election cycle before that, coming into this race, with public matching and with the new electoral system, folks were willing to kind of use that algorithm in a way to set themselves up to kind of dishonestly win in an election. I think ultimately, if you have good strategy and you have enough money to be collaborative, we were able to help promote people that their bases really truly believed in, and I built that trust with those people because I kept showing up for them as well, that they naturally just transferred over to me in terms of ranking me 2 or 3, which was super helpful in our election cycle. And then I think one of the challenges with voters was helping folks really understand the power behind ranking and what that meant of just not selecting one person, because we had a lot of people that continuously got the message that you didn't have to pick 5, you could just pick 1, but that there is actual voter power behind choosing more than one person. It was a lot of folks that were just kind of the apathetic or the usual voter, the consistent voter that was like, I don't want to deal with having to know all of this. But it's, at the same time, I would say, but you're tired of your mailbox is getting filled up with voter literature. So you have all the options to be able to choose more than one person. So I think that was a challenge of encouraging people this first cycle, like, yes, this is our permanent system from this point on, and yes, you will have plenty more opportunities to use ranked choice voting. But that doesn't mean you give up on this one because you don't want to learn a new system right away. So definitely encouraging people to select more than one person. And then I think voters generally just had a hard time fighting against the apathy. And I think that was because it was a post-COVID election. They were seeing an active and like engaged debate in our local government of should we delay it, should we not, is there going to be money in the budget to actually do the outreach and education, is it worth it if voter turnout is going to be low? And that kind of, I think, stifled people's encouragement to come out. And it was really, the onus was really put on individual candidates and like CBOs, like Rank the Vote, who were out there trying to make sure like we wanted people to come out, we wanted people to understand the system. It was not as difficult as it might have been seemingly in selecting or being able to have valid ballots. But I really do think that it was like the best opportunity for folks to see that there is power behind getting representation. As Cliff mentioned, I'm a part of the first female majority in New York City Council's history. And honestly, like, I joke around a lot with my colleagues because we have a Black, Latino, Asian caucus, we have a women's caucus that both kind of feel redundant at this point. We are the majority, BIPOC are the majority, women are the majority. We're no longer fighting for priorities because all of our priorities are on the table. And I think this re-election cycle is what I've been trying to encourage voters to understand. Like, we have so much opportunity now, and people holding major chair positions in committee caucuses, because people came out, because people ranked, because we had a system that didn't cost our local government more money with runoffs. My election, the numbers were so close that I would have had to have a runoff election, but because of RCV, we were able to widen that win gap, and that was super helpful. It would have been more costly, voter turnout would have been lower initially on our actual primary day had we had to have a runoff, and I think those benefits is what we need to relate back to voters, is the tax dollars really at work, their electoral system working for them for the most part. But we have to be more inclusive for sure. We have to think about who's not at the table. Language access is always something that we're battling. Language access is definitely an issue that we have. I think across the board we have to work out, and it's not just the main ones of whatever city you represent. We gotta go get community and be able to find the local dialects to make sure we're engaging as many people as possible. But yeah, overall, I think most folks are looking forward to being re-engaged on RCB in New York City.
This is fantastic. Much of my research looks at voter engagement, and particularly in immigrant communities. And what we've seen for 20 years in polling data is Asian Americans and Latinos saying, no one bothered to knock on my door. No one bothered to call me and tell me there's an election happening. I don't know how to participate. I have 3 jobs that I'm working. And I think it's so exciting to hear the candidate perspective, because too often it falls upon the candidates then to do so much of this mobilizing work, right? And I'm hearing just the great challenge that went into doing that education, ensuring that there's the campaign dollars to do that outreach, and ensuring that these other good governance practices are already in place so that that can happen. We can have this kind of collaboration. So that's really powerful stuff. In addition to the candidates, however, there's also a whole lot of grassroots organizers that are doing the work on the ground. And I want to turn now to Mike Griffin, who is doing so much work in the state of Minnesota. And I want to hear a little bit more about the impact of RCB, particularly on voters of color in the Twin Cities.
Good morning, I am Mike Griffin. I have been a proud advocate of ranked choice voting since about 2012. I first arrived in Minneapolis in the early 2000s, and our city council was majority white males, okay? We have one black male that represented North Minneapolis where the black people live, but the majority of our city council were old, rich, white men, okay? And ranked choice voting has fundamentally changed the composure of our city council. First Latina elected, first one elected. We got a trans woman president of our city council. First in the nation. First trans man elected, first Somali elected in the nation, and I can go on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ranked choice voting gives more choice and more power to people who look like me, and here's why. Previously in Minneapolis, when I first got there, when the city council was old, rich, white, was because we had a 2-step process. People who showed up in the August primary, y'all are familiar with the primary process. 2-step process. People who show up in the primary process typically are old, rich, white people, let's be honest. And in my official job, I work at community change. And I, every day, work to determine what doors we knock on and the strategy to get people elected in primaries and in a general election. There are people who make money to determine what doors we knock on. And in a primary, those people who vote are only people who are targeted who are old, rich, white people. Those people vote in the August primary. And then people who look like me show up in November. And then we select from a diluted 2 people who've been selected by old, rich, white people in August. That calls for our city council to be old, rich, white people. Y'all buy what I'm selling. And now we have a city council that is actually working for the people. When I first started in 2007, I was an organizer for Barack Obama in the South Side of Jamaica, Queens. Hillary Clinton was a senator running for president. Y'all follow me? John Edward was also running. I was a young 20-year-old organizer for Barack Obama. I went out in the hood, knocked on the door. If people told me they were voting for Hillary Clinton, what did I do? Speak back at me. If somebody, I knock on the door, 20-year-old, hey, I'm Mike Griffin, I'm an organizer for Barack Obama. They tell me they support Hillary Clinton, what did I do? That was the end of that conversation. The end of that conversation. In a ranked choice voting election, you need to ask what issues they care about to potentially move that voter to be a second choice voter. Ranked choice voting fundamentally changes not only how you vote, but the conversation we have at the door. It changes how you campaign, fundamentally. And then it changes how they govern. Because you have campaigned to win 51% and not just win an election with the 30% or getting the highest vote, you have to win a majority, so you actually govern with the decree of the people. In Minneapolis, we passed $15 an hour minimum wage. Earned sick and sick time. We have the majority of Minneapolis that voted for rent control. We have our entire state council that has supported our consent decree with the federal government to fix our police department that killed George Floyd. Gotta get a round of applause. And that's all because it fundamentally changes elections and how we govern in this country. We believe what the council member from New York, Amanda, said, that ranked choice voting fundamentally gives more power to voters. And Cliff, you're not gonna steal my shine with Chance. But I've been known to say ranked choice voting gives more choice, you scream out more power. I say more choice, you say more power. More choice! More power! More choice! More power! More choice! More power! Ranked choice voting fundamentally gives more choice and more power to people of color. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
I gotta tell you, there's a lot of pessimism about ranked choice voting in the Golden State, and I think y'all are changing some minds today. So this is pretty exciting stuff. I mean, I could talk to y'all for all day long, but we only have a little bit of time left. And so I wanted to open it up to the floor and see if there are questions from our audience today for our amazing panelists. Yes, I don't know if anyone comes around with a microphone for you, but I could if need be.
Struggle with getting on and off. It might not be good. It might not be good for all of us.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out where to stand so I can see you. Hi, thank you so much for everything. I've had the pleasure of meeting at least one of you this week. Is that a little better? Okay, thank you. My question is that, like, in this democracy reform space, I don't think that there is enough honesty about why we need to reform. I've heard a lot about, like, politics have become so divisive over the past 50 years. Sorry, I've heard that politics have become so divisive over the past 50 years, et cetera, et cetera. And we more or less know the answer to that is racism. Like, it's that hard, but how do we bridge that into our conversations as we're building bigger coalitions and actually address fundamentally the fundamental issues with our democracy, which I think has a lot to do with racism in this country.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and if I can paraphrase, I think what you're saying is, often we hear about electoral reform as this antidote to polarization. But what is polarization? We have a Democratic Party that is a big tent with a whole lot of people of color in it. So underlying this is actually racism. And you want to take a stab at that question? How do we bridge this? How do we bring racism back to the center of this conversation? Do we need to, in order to advance these kinds of electoral reforms?
So it's a great question. And it actually it reminds me of an incident that happened this week. I'm not going to go into all the details. Long story short was my co-founder, Natasha, maybe some of y'all may be familiar with, was in a discussion about political violence. And, basically the person was saying that, 80% of the country doesn't support political violence. And she was saying, well, that's not true, because there's a lot of people that support racial violence. It's just when it spills over, when that same Confederate flag spills into the Capitol and becomes political violence, now it's like, ooh, look what, I'm shocked to find that there are people that become violent about elections, and Black folks are like, welcome to my life, right? And so we've gotta have, to your point, we've gotta have honest conversations about that. And I think the only way, for me, to answer that is to say that those conversations just have to happen. People have to be courageous enough to enter that element into the discussion, so that when somebody is talking, just as you said, when somebody's talking about that polarization, to point out, well, a lot of that polarization started with racial polarization, right? It continues to this day as racial polarization. Just as some of the issues that we see in the economy, with the tip wage, right? Like with healthcare, many of those, it's the essence of the 1619 Project. Much of that started with race, with anti-Blackness, and then it spills over, and then you turn around, and all of us are without healthcare, or all of us are with stagnant wages, or all of us are with political violence or polarized elections. So I think you raised the point. What you did is the answer. You raise it in whatever discussion that you're in.
I think, look, fundamentally, this is about power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? Who gets to determine who controls it? And so, yes, racism is a factor. Sexism is a yes. Okay. Sexism is a factor. All of the isms play a role, because historically, the way the system has been structured and operated, it has been for the benefit of those who actually held the pen writing the founding documents, right? The person, the people who control the pen, control the power. So I do believe it is important for us to acknowledge and have an understanding of kind of what the drivers are at the base level, right? So that we can be intentional about dismantling racism, sexism, all of the isms as we're working to move forward. I also think it is important for us to keep in mind that this is about power. Because, and I'm going to say it because I think it's important for us to hold on to it, this is not just about representation. Yes, as a Black woman, I want to see women who look like me holding that pen, sitting in seats of power and influence, but I don't want to see me reflected back for the sake of seeing me reflected back. I need something to be different. So what happens with that power matters, which is why I do want to go back to Mike's point about values. Because I think ultimately ultimately what I want to see is a democracy that is representative of all of us and representative of all of our values and is actively advancing our collective values. And so in an RCB system, what we have is the opportunity to build partnerships and coalitions with people who we might not otherwise build partnerships and coalitions with, regardless of what they look like. I want what you're gonna do when you get there, okay? So yes, on racism, we cannot forget in the conversation sexism, because women of color have had some of the hardest times breaking into these power structures. So it is the twin, racism and sexism, to be mindful of.
People who have experienced racism, Black people in Minneapolis, there's some of those Black people who are against the system. And here's why. This is why it's about power. They benefit from the system. They like the two process where they can pick the voters that are showing up in the August primary. They like that system. Some unions like that system, right? Because they have gamed the system to pick the people that we all show up in November to vote for. So there are, that's why I think it's past what the system was saying. I think it's past racism. I think it gets to the core of power in this country and taking it back to us and being able to rank our own. So thank you for that question.
So my question is about what you do in this scenario here in LA. The racist hate speech that we heard from the recording from our council members last year, in part was in the context of Black versus Latino versus Black redistricting process, which of course happens with single seat winner take all districts. LA City Council right now is conducting a process to look at enlarging the council. It hasn't been enlarged since 1925. We have the worst per capita representation in the country, 15 people for 4 million. So the groundwork has not been done in this area to go to multi-seat proportional ranked choice voting. Yet that would be the system that could alleviate these conflicts. And instead the council looks like it's only going to increase the council size by a few seats, and we're going to miss a once in decades. So we're about to blow it at an historic level. And what do when we're about to blow it and you know what the right answer is, but the groundwork hasn't been done and the clock is ticking?
Maybe I do about what's happening in LA. You're right. We have a political moment in Los Angeles, and there is no groundswell to have broader conversations about what the range of possibilities could even be. Anytime I bring that up, it is shut down real quick. Notably, I'm a part of a group of scholars that put together a set of recommendations for the city council. We included in it, don't just expand the seats. We got a lot of pushback because we suggested a mixed system. Throw some we put in at-large districts as well. We can work on that. But what has happened is it has opened a conversation to some extent about what else could the range of possibilities be. And most certainly, at least I know when I testified before City Council, I said, look, you can increase the seats, but that's not going to change the chemistry of this council. A council that has had corruption scandal after corruption scandal, in which we have multiple members of our city council who have been convicted of corruption, another one still indicted for corruption. It's not going to change that system. There are a lot of differences, however, right? New York City, Chicago have strong mayors. We don't. And I don't know that we want to switch and move away from that. So I think there's plenty of conversations to be had. You know, I think one of the things in California that I reflect a whole lot on from my work at the Redistricting Commission for the state. You know, Tanisha was talking before about changing the system and what that feels like. Well, in California, we're a very diverse place. We are a majority-minority state. The rest of the country, yes, thank you. Yes, we're proud of our diversity in California. It is something to be celebrated. And you know, by all measures, the state's redistricting commission was wildly successful. We passed our maps 15-0. Like it was a unanimous passage of Democrats and Republicans and independents coming together and agreeing on these single member districts that we drew. We expanded opportunities for Latinos, the nearly majority of the state of California. to elect the candidates of their choice, using the Voting Rights Act as that tool. But because it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, I was left feeling so disheartened, because what I saw were communities of color fighting for representation, for legitimate claims for representation, using a tool that's perhaps not really adequate to racial, multi-ethnic democracy. So I think there's so many more to be had. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about that. But you're right. We are in this moment where we'll be lucky if we just get an expansion.
So I'm glad some of the context was given because I'm from New York City, so I did want to comment on your politics. Every state's and municipalities' politics obviously are super ingrained in how representation is implemented or fought for or won. What I will say, please continue to have hope. That sounds as cliche as it is and corny, but please have some hope. I believe even expanding is important. The New York City Council, we have close to 9 million people now, but way back when, we went from about 11-15 to 32, 33, and now we're at 51. It took time, but it happens. It can happen. Additionally, I want to say redistricting happens every decade, right? We know it's going to come. We always anticipate. We're trying to work within that decade of how do we, improve on the quality of life for our residents. How do we get more representation? How do we, reform a lot of our policies and politics? But that doesn't mean the foundational stuff, the working local groups in community or political groups to help pull maybe some of those corrupt people out of office, triggering some primaries, breaking down those power structures of where who is helping out whomever and who is molding the next person that's going to do nothing in that seat. That is really like breaking down those power structures within counties or municipalities or in the state. To me, is how I've even seen New York City politics and those dynamics completely shift. It's how I challenged the 14-year senator council in the seat that went prior, really breaking down their local support of, I don't know how the positions are broken up here, but we have like district leaders, like community captain kind of roles, state committee people, taking those seats little by little, every election cycle to kind of break up where the power is held mostly and how like the next of kin or the nepotism happens, is really important in this entire process as well, because it's how you really get to representation that people, and not necessarily the person that's on the shoulder to come in and might have no experience at all, and really just keep the same machinations happening cycle after cycle. So don't ever forget that other aspect too, and I'm not saying, play the 10-year long game. Depending on your election cycles, you can play a 2-year game, and every 2 years play that game. I had a 4-year gap before I could run again, and I challenged the incumbent's state committee member. I won by 96 votes. And I ran after my city council race, I ran right after that next summer, and I was able to pull one person, and I ran with 10 other people, and 3 of them won. And then 2 years cycle of pulling away the facade of their foundation, where they had that went into their building and told everyone who to vote for. Like, now I pulled that person out, and I had my own person who could kind of say, here's what the field looks like, show up for the primary. So, looking at those structures is important.
We've got lightning round, 2 more questions. So again, quick questions and relatively quick answers.
Hi, thank you guys. My name is Melissa Antona. I am a resident of Nevada, where in 2022 we passed the initial passage for ranked choice voting, open primaries. You're welcome. Yeah, it's part of that. However, because it's a constitutional amendment, it needs to pass a second time in 2024. I want to read a quote from one of our senators, Jackie Rosen, where she says she has serious concerns about the initiative, that it can make casting a ballot more confusing and time-consuming, lead to increased errors that cause eligible votes to be thrown out, and disproportionately impact communities of color. This is a dog whistle. I know this. I'm sure you guys know this. And it's been disheartening to see communities of color actually take this, identify it, and be like, oh no, I don't want to learn about this because it's too confusing, I'm gonna vote no. Have you guys heard this in the field? Probably Mike, you especially, since you've been doing a lot of grassroots organizing. And what is the most compelling, statement against this argument?
Yeah, I mean, it is completely insulting to think that people of color, people can't break. This is what we do on a daily basis, every day. When I woke up today, I decided I was gonna wear, what shirt was I gonna wear so I had a partner? I thought, hey, should I wear a shirt that matches this? Should I wear a t-shirt? This is Richard, and I ranked them. And I decided to go with a plaid shirt followed by a blue vest. And I think that that was a good choice, all right? And so Black people, everybody does this on a regular basis, right? Everybody does it. In Minneapolis, and this has been tested in cities, and has been proven that Black people and people of color rank just as high as white people. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, we did tests, we saw every single demographic ranked over 90% of the time. And the only reason you didn't rank is because you wanted to bullet vote, because that was a candidate strategy to bullet vote. And if it's a candidate strategy to bullet vote, some people will. But the notion that Black people can't rank, I think it's fundamentally insulting. 2, everyone who is educated about ranked choice voting likes it, accepts it, does it, and then reports afterwards that they like to accept that data. It goes across demographics. You have to educate people on ranked choice voting. So cities who are looking forward, if you're passing it, we have to do an education campaign. Because it's different, but it's not confusing. It is different and not confusing, and that's what I was saying.
So if I just real quickly, Scott, I agree with everything that Mike said, right? There is a challenge though. And honestly, my wife, some of y'all may have seen my wife did a session like this in Harvard last week. And part of what some organizers there from various parts of the country raised, and I agree with, is that while we do it just as much or just as well as any other community, what we know is that when you layer all the issues of voter suppression, right, what you find is that the penalties will then be disproportionately meted out, right? So, there's an argument about voter ID, right? That, we can get it just as much as everybody else. Some people say, no, we have difficulties getting it. But the penalties are meted out differently by communities. So that particular statement is a dog whistle. And everything Mike said is true, but we do have to be mindful, particularly in certain communities, in some states, in some counties even, the ways that if there are differences, the way that people get penalized for that, and the way that it creates a stigma. So not giving credence to the overall point that they're making, but just being mindful. And then just quickly, the other piece on that is the education piece. The materials that we posted in the Hoover app talk about ways and themes that we found and the researchers found in talking to Black communities that help to deal with some of that education, to help deal with what my brother over here was talking about in terms of basically, it deals with emphasizing the values that we've talked about. We talk about self-determination, we talk about more choice, right? And so there are ways that we can incorporate the right values, including love, because remember Dr. King said, power without love is reckless and abusive, but love without power is sentimental and anemic. And so in all the work we do, we talk about power, but we also talk about centering everything we do in love, and we include that in the messaging about this sometimes complex and new system that we find that our communities are very receptive to.
So I do want to yes to all of that. I do want to pick up on the disproportionate impact disciplinary action when there is some alleged voting violation. Yes, it is true. The data bears out that people of color tend to experience greater disciplinary action. But it's not just limited to ranked choice voting. I want to make that clear because it is across the board when it comes to exercising this right to vote. And it is something that we definitely need to be mindful of in this movement holistically, regardless of what the structural reform is that we're trying to advance.
Can I just quickly, this can also be fun. The education component can also be fun. On my campaign, I realized I didn't want people to see this only as like electoral or political and making decisions on how to rank. So I took one of the most controversial things in New York City, our public transit system. And I ranked, do you want to ride a bike to work, take the bus to work, take the train to work? And in each of those sections of which ones they could rank, I created mini bios like, the train is always a 20-minute delay, right? Like I had on my survey that we would go to doors with and we would help people understand, like, how do you want to get to work and what's your preferred method? If you went outside and it was raining and cycling was your number one option, okay, what's your number two option on that day? And creating these concepts for people, because yes, like choosing a red shirt or a blue shirt, yes, we do this every day, but helping build out why you want people to rank your candidates or why you want people to rank on these issues is so important in this process of education that I think, like, to that quote of that senator, like, same shit, different state, but there's ways to implement this in a real way for people to feel confident going into that ballot box, because we're helping their thoughts around single issues and around the individual candidates and why they're working collaboratively or not.
Literally, we're doing this in 2 minutes.
Okay, I guess I've been told there's time, so thank you for being patient. Sorry, your question. So I guess the reason I find ranked choice voting so compelling is because I think it does broaden the kind of room for diversity on the ballot box, and it does make sure that we have a genuinely representative set of elected officials. And I think that for me, there's a very strong symbolic appeal there that a lot of people have kind of tapped into during this discussion. But I did grow up in New Jersey and New Hampshire, and having lived in swing states, I do know that there is an entirely different contingent of voters who might be kind of center or center right and might stand to benefit in terms of like operational ideology from greater representation like this, but who nonetheless have a very different conception of what it means to be American, which is not like multiracial, pluralistic, and in the same like kind of ways that we're tapping into this symbolic ideology. And so I'm really curious, like if ideas come up, how do you think that we should tap into the symbolic appeals to people who have maybe a different conception of American representation? Thanks.
So I want to jump on that because I think it's important to lift up, to remind us all that one reform is not the beginning and end of the conversation. And so one of the things that I like to think about in the context of ranked choice voting is also nonpartisan elections, right? It is important to note that most of our organizations up here are nonpartisan. Okay, so we can shout it. We are nonpartisan, and so I do think it is. If the goal is to have representation that the majority of people want, then if the goal is to truly advance democracy, then I do think it is important for us to be mindful of how we are advancing some of these reforms so that we are not stopping the conversation before it can even get started. I believe that ranked choice voting is good for democracy, period. Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, I don't care. I believe it is good for democracy because it means that the majority of the people get the person that they want in office. And so I think that, as we're advancing RCB, and I see it, as we're advancing RCB, I think we should also be thinking about some other complementary reforms that can help ensure that we're not unintentionally creating a system, advancing a system that creates more political divisiveness, because that's not good for democracy. Y'all didn't like that nonpartisan comment. I know.
with that, I think we are at or past time. What an incredible time for a Friday morning. There's nowhere else I would rather go. Thank you all so much. Let's keep the conversation going. Enjoy the rest of your day.